All right, so now we're being recorded. And then let's see, Whitney, will you be my 45-minute person to remind us that we're being recorded? Thank you very much. To you, those of you that are a little bit late joining us, I did say earlier that I'm going to mute everybody except for Nisha and me, and we'll be the only ones talking. And then there, until we get to the point where we're taking questions, and then we'll unmute everybody. And I think with that, I'm going to offer a prayer, and then I'm going to ask Nisha a few questions. And then she has a presentation she wants to give to us. And then we'll do question and answer. I know that sounded like a lot, but it's really pretty simple. So if you will join me in a word of prayer. Thank you, Father. Lord Jesus, we come to you this evening together, a company of people who seek to follow you, who trust you. Holy Spirit, superintend our meeting. We submit ourselves to you. Lord, I pray that you would bless Nisha tonight, that in her sharing with us and listening as we ask our questions and understanding, Lord, how her good work is so helpful to us and so meaningful, that she would be deeply blessed and satisfied. Lord, I pray you give us ears to hear what the Spirit is saying, that we would understand both intellectually and spiritually more about how to help one another or even help ourselves. So we give you thanks. We give you this time in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, let's see if I can mute everybody. Okay, continue. So Nisha, can you unmute yourself, Nisha? Okay.
Yep, got it.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Just shake your head. Okay, very good. Okay, Nisha Hootman, just a few questions. I want to be accurate. So you are a psychologist. Is that correct? All right.
That's correct.
That's correct. So why did you decide to become a psychologist? That's an interesting thing.
So in college, I was an English major, but didn't really think I wanted to be a teacher or that I would be good at that. And so I realized that part of what I loved about novels, which was what I enjoyed most, it was the characters and character development, and that really I was more interested in people than I was in literature. So I started taking more psych classes and really got into it, grooved on research, and just enjoyed that kind of work. And so when I went off to grad school, I thought I might become an academic instead. But as I proceeded through a program that prepared you for both, it was clear that I had was better at clinical work and found it more fulfilling, I guess. And so I became a clinician.
Yeah, so I know you. I would say I know you a little bit. I think I know Joe more than I know you, but I know you well enough to know that you love people. It's clear, easy to see that you love people. I appreciate that. So, where did you do your graduate work?
At the University of Minnesota.
University of Minnesota, UM.
In the 90s.
At the Golden Gophers, is that right?
Yes, the Golden Gophers.
Golden Gophers. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And then, what brought you to Texas?
Well, we had gone to undergrad at Trinity in San Antonio. And
okay. All right.
And I'm from Texas originally, and Joe's from North Dakota. And so that, we just kind of go this way in terms of where we live. And so we were up there for about almost a decade, and then we're ready for a change, and we were going to switch, and I was going to stay home, and Joe was going to do computer work, and we came down to Austin.
All right. Well done. Cool. So where were you raised in Texas, or where were you from in Texas?
Tyler, East Texas.
Wow. That's like deep Texas there.
That is deep Texas. Yeah.
Texas right there.
Got a twang. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, I wanted to there's one other question I wanted to ask you. I think everybody here would understand this. So when did you decide to follow Jesus? Were you young or in college or what?
Yeah. So college, a work in progress, but college I was exploring. Yeah, it was, my background, I was raised a Jehovah's Witness till I was 12. My family left, and I floated around to different places, always kind of a seeker. And then in college, actually, in a year that I spent over in England, I was involved with a charismatic Catholic group, and
Gosh, wow.
which was like a powerful force in my life. And so by the time I came home, and I studied with the priest there, and really kind of decided I didn't think I could be Roman Catholic, but when I came home, I was then looking and going to different churches, and somewhere in there, I started dating Joe, and so was baptized in the Lutheran Church.
Well, the Lutherans got you. Well, that's
Yeah.
good on them. That's really good. Hey, thank you. I did not know that you were a JW in the early days. I appreciate you sharing that. All right, so I just want to, all of that, Nisha, just to lay a little groundwork, also to help you relax a little bit, maybe. So why don't you take it from here, and
Okay.
let's talk about depression and or mental health, how far you want to take us, and then I'll open it back up for questions.
Yeah, so I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about what's happening with the pandemic and depression and anxiety, which is closely related, and then a little bit about how our brains work with these things, because I think that's helpful in terms of what we need to do. And then we'll talk directly about caring for ourselves, how to care for others who may be at risk. And then I have some resources at the end that I can share for anybody who needs help or needs to pass on ideas about how to get help to other people. So the numbers are pretty remarkable. Initially I was looking, and the BBC was reporting double rates of depression in the UK, and then there was a study in the US where suicidal thoughts had doubled. And then the more recent stuff came out that for the third quarter of this year, depression had quadrupled for young people in the United States. Anxiety is at 3 times what it was last year during the same quarter. So we're talking about pretty wowy changes, and in its own kind of epidemic. Mental health epidemic is the way people are talking about it, because it's a dramatic change from where we've been, which wasn't great to begin with. We know that these are serious conditions that impact a lot of people anyway, but now there's so many more. So I think some of the trajectory of that will depend on kind of how long this lasts and what happens from here. But most people are expecting there to be fallout. It's not like when the pandemic ends, those problems will end. People's lives have still changed. Just what we know about history, other kinds of events like the Great Depression or the wars, they affected mental health for generations after that. So I'm hopeful that it won't be, quite at that level. I hope that this event is going to be shorter and less impactful than those. But I think it's fair to assume that we are looking at increased rates of these kinds of mood disorders for some years to come. So just to think about kind of what's going on in our brain these days, it helps to have a hand model of the brain.
How do you know? How would you know at the moment?
Saying something I should know? No.
I have no idea where that's coming from.
Okay. So, and you can see my hand, right? So this is your brain, or our brains, and this is the brain stem and the lower brain. And then in here is the limbic system, which is like got a lot of to do with our emotions and emotional expression. And then on top, we have this nice cortical part of our brains that helps us reason and think, problem solve, plan, all those things that we think of as kind of higher level thinking. So it's helpful to know that our lower brains, God really designed us to survive, right? And thrive if possible, but seriously wanted to protect our ability to know when we were safe, when we were not safe, when we should take action to be safe. So our lower brain really picks up signals for when things are not okay, when we might not be safe. And there's some research that suggests that our brains kind of scan our environment 4 times per second to see whether we are safe or not. So that's kind of going on, and beyond consciousness all the time in us. And when our brain decides, our senses, and it's really not decides, because decides sort of like a word that would go with this cortical stuff on top, but if it like senses down here in the lower brain that we're not safe, then that sets off certain body chemicals and the adrenaline and all the systems that help us take action if we need to. So when when this part of our brain is activated constantly in a chronic basis, that's what we call chronic stress. And eventually it will often lead to exhaustion. It can lead to depression. There's a sense in which we have our options about how to respond when we're feeling not safe or sensing that we're not safe. And one of them, a lower brain strategy, is just to shut down. And people who are really depressed, you'll see, will just look very shut down. Like they're not expressing emotion. They have very little energy. They're just kind of shut down. A trainer I know uses it with kids and talks about the possum brain. Like this is where you shut down because that's the safest thing. And then you hope that, whatever's scary out there doesn't get you. The in-between part, this limbic system that's in here, is more active and more emotional. And that's where you get that more kind of fight or flight comes from a little bit higher in the brain. And then you got to get up high before I actually think about, okay, how am I doing and what do I need right now and what would be good for me and what's not good for me, and all that happens up here. So one of the things that happens when we have our lower brains activated like this is that Dan Siegel, who's a neuropsychiatrist, says we flip our lids. So it's like this part of our brain isn't in contact with the rest anymore. I mean, obviously it's still in our skull, so it all still looks like this, but functionally it becomes like this. And we don't really have access to all of that nice problem solving ability anymore, or we can't really think through things anymore. So we're at that point living in just like, how do we survive? How do we stay safe? Maybe some emotional expression depending on where we are here, but not much in terms of ability to really think through things. So some people have described depression as, it looks like anxiety sometimes when you have this lower brain activated due to perceived danger, really. But if you have anxiety sustained long enough, anxiety kind of takes more energy, and some people have described depression as like the anxiety's been on so long, the speakers are blown out, and then you just kind of shut down and get depression. So, in a pandemic, I think that we have a lot of cues that things are not safe. And I remember in the early days of the shutdown, just the fact that there was nobody on the streets was its own like unsafe cue to me. I'm like, I want to look up at the sky and guess what's going to fall when, because it just seems so strange. And I think we've adjusted and our brains have adapted, which is totally what they're made to do, so that we don't sense some of those danger cues, but they still, I think, affect us at times. And even if you actually go to the grocery store yourself or out and about, when you walk into a place and everybody in there has masks on, or people are, standing close together, which somehow doesn't feel as safe anymore, and or they're like working hard not to stand close together. I mean, all these things tell our brains unsafe, 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 right? And so it makes it a pretty stressful situation. So there's all that going on just with kind of living in life as it is now. And also news and media and such, of course, give us a lot of like things are not safe signals. And I'm not saying that any of these things are not appropriate or shouldn't be done, but our brains are under a lot of stress facing these kinds of signals. So I want to explain that a little bit, because we will talk in a few minutes about just different strategies that address those different layers of the brain that get affected in this kind of situation. I also, though, want us to think about the pandemic and coronavirus as a great loss in most people's lives. So most obviously in people who have lost a loved one or lost their lives, of course. Next, I think about the healthcare workers who are living in an incredibly stressful situation where they are, dealing with different risks to themselves and just different needs than they had before. But even people who are, not impacted in that what seems dramatic way, a lot of them have lost work. Some people have lost businesses. the trajectory of life sometimes looks different. Dreams and goals that maybe people had are lost due to economic change. Some people who recover from coronavirus have physical effects left over that impact, kind of where their life is headed and at what speed. So all these things, I think we have collectively a great deal of loss going on. And I also think that that's bigger or has different effects, more difficult effects than, just a personal tragedy. Because what happens for us when we have something that goes off in our lives, or a stressor or a difficulty, is that hopefully we have people around us who help take some of that impact for us. So I think about like the community of Hope Chapel. So one person has, a job loss, or someone die, or an illness or something, and then the people closest to them come around them and offer them support, and the people around them, can offer support to the people in the middle and the people, the person most affected. And so you get kind of this ripple effect where eventually the effects kind of, go back to smoothness, but we have together shared that process of adjusting and absorbing that, which is a lovely thing. Right now, of course, it's so hard because with something that's, faced by our whole society, so many people are affected in one way or another. Really, everybody's affected somehow. And some, a good number of people, even our own community, are affected in more dramatic ways. And so it's really hard to have room for people to kind of absorb some of that hard impact. So I think as loss goes, there are some complications for having it be. It's nice in some ways it's shared. Maybe we feel left alone, less alone. But it's also hard because so many people are suffering at once that it's kind of difficult to cope with all of it at the same time. The other thing about loss, this kind of loss, is that it's kind of ambiguous loss. That's a term that's used sometimes for things that aren't as defined. I don't think we're great at it, but we do have some rituals and ways to get resolution and cope with grief over like the loss of a person. But the kind of loss we're going through right now, there's not a certain ending. It's not a done deal. It's ongoing. There are no rituals really to help us with it. There's just not the same defined nature. And that's not obviously to play down grief at the loss of a loved one or other kinds of grief, just pointing out that this is big and somewhat different, and sometimes kind of harder to get a handle on than other kinds of grief that loss.
Can I ask you to repeat the term you used to describe that?
Ambiguous loss.
I didn't hear that. I'm sorry, ambiguous. Okay.
Ambiguous, yeah.
I do understand ambiguous. I just didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so that's some of the factors that I think are going into our current experience and how depression and anxiety might come out of that. People who tend toward anxiety, and there's just some wiring that can make you prone to either depression or anxiety, or sometimes both. So people who tend toward anxiety may kind of worked up, and it may go away for a while and then come back. I think these are coming in waves often, and it might get attached to certain concerns. Like I've seen a lot of pretty anxious parents recently about online school and what that means for them, and what the demands are going to be, and whether their kids going to learn or not, and how they're going to do their jobs as well. And so like it's there right now. At times, people have a lot of anxiety about, are they going to get sick? Is someone at risk and get sick? So the anxiety kind of move around even to what topic it's on, what it lights on. But I think it represents kind of a brain that is activated, and we have a lot of legitimate concerns, and sometimes it can feel like the anxiety just moves from one to another. And then with depression, again, if you're prone to it and you're in the middle of a pandemic and you're suffering whatever level of loss is happening in your life, and sometimes, for some people, just a real loss of the structure that they're used to kind of make life work for them. And that can be a loss of a job where it's your income, or, you know, students who have lost just the routine of, we go to school every day and this is what we do and we're used to this, and and we see people. And so sometimes people just sort of do a shutdown, which is, you know, a basic self-protection move really, but it's not one that's chosen. It's just your brain kind of going like, whoa, things are not okay. We better just hang tight here and, you know, play possum if needed and wait it out. So I think our brains are adaptive. You know, God's had good sense, obviously, in designing them. They help us get through difficult situations. And sometimes the way the strategies our brains are using to adapt to a situation, you know, has other effects that are causing us distress or problematic. And so that's part of how we get diagnoses for mental health concerns. So let's see, depression symptoms, just so people are familiar with those: depressed mood, which is sometimes looking irritable, and irritability is more common in in kids and teens, and sometimes young adults. Anhedonia, which is the loss of pleasure and things that you used to enjoy, a lack of energy, sometimes like moving slowly or moving in an agitated way. Either one can be a sign of depression. Problems with sleep, problems with appetite, or weight loss or gain that's not, you know, intentional and caused by something we know. And so, you know, and loss of concentration. So those are all signs that someone's just not doing very well. And, you know, I think you can imagine how these things have become so prevalent in the middle of the pandemic, because it seems like these naturally go together. So that's something about depression and anxiety. Let me talk a little bit about how we care for ourselves in the midst of this. I think one thing, because there's so much loss involved, it would be similar to other grief, where we need to give ourselves room to mourn. You know, it doesn't necessarily help to kind of cover our ears and pretend it's not happening and go blah, 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 which sometimes it can be helpful for, you know, we need to take breaks. So sometimes a little escapism is okay. One of the songs I've been listening to during the pandemic is called Can We Pretend? You know, I'm like, can we just pretend this is not happening and that everything will turn out okay? That's one of the lines. So I get that.
Oops. Okay, so you froze. Okay, it's okay. So, Nisha, you
So
froze.
her office Wi-Fi resets near the top of the hour sometimes.
Okay.
Sometimes, and I'm guessing that's what happened.
Okay. So,
And she will probably hop back on shortly.
okay. Thank you for that, Joe.
Yeah.
So everybody else, I hope you're writing down questions you want to ask, or you came with a few questions. If not, take a minute now while we're in a forced break here to write down questions. I have several I've written down already. Okay, Nisha, are you back?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So
My internet just dropped and I
Joe
our other one.
Joe took good care of you while you were gone.
Great.
So you left off where you were talking about self-care, giving ourselves room to mourn.
Yep.
And some escapism is okay, and pretty quickly after that you drop.
Okay. So taking room to actually actively mourn sometimes means really lamenting. I mean, this is a great time for all those Psalms where everything is not super happy. You know, I think we have great examples for just trying to get through tough times, partly by saying and, you know, telling God how tough this is, and sometimes telling other people how it is. Sometimes people find it helpful to write those things, but we need some ways to just lament that this is not what I wanted. This is not what I thought life was going to be, all the losses that we're facing. Sometimes people express that with words. There are, you know, obviously people in our midst that express it through art, which is another good way to just get it out there and be able to look at it, which keeps us from being so overwhelmed with it. You know, it's okay to cry. Obviously, I've cried more during the pandemic than I did before that, just because there are moments that it all seems like a lot to deal with. So some ways to kind of get it out, or be able to express it is important. And also, you know, we need to accept that at times we are not going to be at our best. I did have some people early in the pandemic who great and kind of had this idea that the pandemic would be a great time to get all these amazing things done they didn't have time to do otherwise. And I think probably for a few people that has panned out, and I'm hopeful that we will see some creative, you know, productions after the pandemic of kind of what people have been working on during, but also want to note that that's not necessarily a realistic expectation for everyone to have. It's actually a harder time to produce things or get things done that it wouldn't be otherwise. And so we just sometimes need to accept that we're not going to be, you know, firing on full go. Another important part of caring for ourselves that goes with that brain model that I talked about is that we need to increase safety cues for ourselves as much as we can. So let's increase safety cues and decrease unsafe cues. So we're trying to calm our brains down and let them know that everything's going to be okay. So that for most people, that means limiting your intake of news and negative. You know, and I know families where there's been tension because for some people, it feels like knowing as much as possible about what's going on is, you know, makes them feel more in control, is more helpful, which is fine if that works for them. But then I've had, you know, like kids who are listening to their parents talk about the pandemic and get really overwhelmed. And so sometimes our limit of it even has to be saying to those that we care about, like, I can't hear any more of that right now, or can you know, you need to discuss that elsewhere because it's too much for me. And you know, we have to watch that for the young people who are not going to be able to say that for themselves too, just to be aware that they are also absorbing whatever we're saying, even if we don't have the TV news on at the time. So limiting our intake of that input, increasing some small comforts when we can. So for some people, you know, being in nature has been really helpful for this. In our homes, we can increase our safety cues just with simple things like, you know, our favorite cup with a warm drink, if that's your thing, or the comfy chair that you like to sit in, or, you know, in our house, we have animals that help us all regulate our emotions. So, you know, petting the furry object in your furry creature in your house. Those are all good things for helping us feel safe, really. And then, of course, connecting, however possible, with other people is very important and one of the challenges of the pandemic. And I think doing this online is a great option. Doing things out in, you know, in the air where it's apparently safer is good, but staying connected with those who are close to us, and even with strangers who we can have, you know, brief but friendly interactions with, that those are safety cues for us. So as much as it's like sort of scary to see everybody in masks, if you see somebody's eyes smile at you and somebody says, you know, ask how you're doing or whatever, that's positive. And that's a cue to our brain that really everything is okay. And so having those kinds of interactions as much as we can safely have, I think is important. And physical presence, I think, does add something beyond the online. And so doing that in ways that we can safely do are good. So finding or returning to something you enjoy is also really good. So hobbies, creative pursuits, playfulness in any way is super good for our brains. Playfulness is both possible when we feel safe and helps us feel safe. And that isn't, so sometimes that's playing a game, but sometimes that's just finding something to laugh at, especially with other people, or approaching life in a playful way is good. New hobbies are great for just kind of keeping us stimulated and going. Familiar things that we have enjoyed before are important for the familiarity. I know I usually just do jigsaw puzzles like around the holidays. It's kind of my thing when I usually, you know, have a little bit more time to be home. And I have been doing them throughout the pandemic. And, you know, that's just my ongoing, I need an extra time to be quiet and do something that doesn't take too much effort, but kind of engages me, right? So you just have to find what regulates you and kind of helps you feel calm and safe, and it's worth spending some time doing those things. So my last thing about caring for ourselves is that we need to seek what we need. So this is hard because it means we have to perceive what we need, which can be really tough. But one of the best protections against depression is knowing what you need, asking to have those needs met, and having that work at least some of the time. So noticing what we need may mean like physically noticing, oh, I need some physical comfort. What can I do to give myself rest, or, nourishment, or hydration, or that sort of thing? What do I need with connection with others, and then seeking that out, which in a pandemic sometimes means, calling an old friend or FaceTiming somebody, or, trying to connect the way that we can. And even with the input we get from the outside, you have to kind of try to sense what you need to hear. So Gino and I talked a little bit about this beforehand, but sometimes we are in need mainly of compassion or comfort, and trying to kind of accept where we're at, even if we're struggling. And, you can look for that. You can look for it in the music you listen to, in the podcast or sermons that you listen to. You can seek that out. There may be other times when what you mainly need is exhortation or just encouragement to keep on going. And then you may need to tell somebody, I need you to express confidence in me, or I need you to provide accountability for me. But the more we know about what we need at any one time, and it can change over time, and seek that out, and it doesn't have to work all the time, but at least sometimes have those needs met. That's a helpful protection against depression. So likewise, if we extend these thoughts to caring for others, all the things that you can help provide some of those safety cues for the people that you care about, and even for strangers, just by offering a little bit of care, maybe some practical help, a smile with your eyes, even if you're masked. That's worth it to provide for others. If you have people that are struggling, that are close to you, one thing is to ask them what they need. So if you assume, what they need is comfort, or what they need is kind of a more exhortation, encouragement, or whatever, and you get it wrong, then that's not the end of the world, but it's not as helpful. So a lot of people, especially if they're struggling, are not going to know immediately what they need. So if you say, how can I help you? They're like, I don't know, that just feels like another demand. But if you give them some multiple choice, or maybe just gently say, well, I want to be helpful. If you think about it for a while, and if you know what would be of help to you, let me know, or I'll ask you again. So that we're just kind of suggesting to people that they can have some sense of what they need, and then giving them time to kind of sort that out, and offering to do what we can for them. You do want to, when people are open to it and they're struggling, we want to come alongside them. Sometimes they're not going to know what they need, and coming alongside them is going to mean, I know you guys did some of this earlier in the pandemic, but you turn on the cameras and you just sort of hang out together, even though you're online. Obviously with family members, you may be hanging out with them in your homes, but it doesn't have to be a big activity. Sometimes just being present. And we also know, to go with some of the brain stuff, that our brains wire together with other people, especially people that we're close to. So we will eventually develop some of the same kind of brain chemicals and brain states that are going on with somebody else. So or with people close to us. So one of the best things that we can offer for people around us is to be kind of in the best state that we can be in. So taking care of ourselves and being in a good place on our own, and then able to come alongside someone else and provide that neurostability. Really, you're sort of offering them your neural system to lean on while theirs is not in a great place. Another thing that's important for when people are having a hard time is to listen and reflect their emotions. So if somebody says, I'm so bummed out because now my school's not meeting, or my job is over and I don't know when I'll find another one, or whatever it is, our tendency sometimes is to start, making suggestions about what they could do about that, or encourage them by saying like, no, it's okay. And mostly people need first to just have their emotions reflected to them, because it kind of helps us understand what's going on with ourselves when we see that, and makes us feel less alone. And we know that any trauma that we face not alone is less risky for our systems. So, saying back to them with a voice that suggests you get it, like, oh, I know it's so hard that you lost that job that you love so much, right? So you're starting with just where they're at and meeting them there and reflecting them back. So that can be a good step to help them understand their own feelings. And then with that, of course, like, it's not usually helpful to do comparisons of other people who are suffering more. And that is one thing that is true in a pandemic. Like, whatever people we know are going through, there are probably people that we have read about in the news lately, or maybe even know personally, who are going through something worse in our estimation. But that kind of comparison of suffering is not usually supportive. So just kind of meeting people where they're at with what they need is more helpful. So those are my comments. I think I've gone over, and I'm sorry about that. I thought I was maybe short. Got more to say than I know. In terms of, let's see, I will maybe, like Joe said, just put a list of links in the chat, and then people can get a hold of those. I put in there information about where you would find mental health help in town, including the local NAMI, which is National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. They have a resource page that's good. Psychology Today, some people don't know what to start there. If you or somebody you care about are looking for therapy, you can go to psychologytoday.com and you can check mark, like if they want to use an insurance, you check that. You can check Christian approach. You can check depression or anxiety, whatever problem you have, and the city, and it will give you a list of people in town. And so that generally is the most efficient way to get started if you're looking for help. I did put a couple of Christian counseling centers that I respect on here. And then I put my email address, because I'm always happy. I don't see Hope Heights professionally, but I'm always happy to help people find the help they need. Yeah. So I think that's about it. I'm going to add that to chat, and I'm interested in what you guys are thinking.
Okay. All right, so let's do this. If you have a question already prepared, would you raise your hand and I'll start calling you off. If not, I have some questions I can ask. But if you have something on your mind, just raise your hand right now.
And just a reminder, we are still recording, right?
We're recording. We're about halfway through now, just a little less than halfway through. Okay. I don't see any hands. Am I missing anybody? I see some pictures.
I have a.
Okay, Lynn.
Okay, so Nisha, thank you. That was so easy to understand. One of the terms you said was firing on full go. And I remember listening to an MD from Germany talking about how when we talking to somebody face to face, there's a connection between our eyes 6 times a second. And I always think of that as a gold standard, as opposed to being on a Zoom call. Now I've changed my standards because we're on Zoom so much. But can you speak to that? I mean, you talked about being able to make connections with the eyes above the mask. Am I making sense?
So are you talking about connection between people or in our own heads?
Yeah, no. When 2 people are looking at each other and talking, there's a connection that goes from brain to brain, whichever part, between the eyes, and it's 6 times a second.
Yeah.
Firing on full go.
Right, firing on full go. Yeah, so we do have, and we know more about mirror neurons now, which is important for development, but is important for just adults trying to, navigate in the world, because it's part of how it's almost like we look in the mirror, except it's better than that, because it's like we look in the mirror and have somebody else's perspective kind of added in, and we're not all alone with it. And I really think that now, I'm talking to some of the students I work with who have started online school, in some ways it's working, like they get the content and some of them get to actually see faces for the other students and such. But I think that there's just something about physical presence that is different, and that it's pretty biological, and like we're just not getting the same sync up that we would in person. So certainly, you know, it's better than nothing. I'm super grateful that we are not as isolated as we would be without doing this, but it is not the same. And I, you know, I see, of course, conversations among therapists about doing teletherapy versus seeing people in person with masks on. So it's a big conversation right now. Most people are opting for teletherapy because it's very different. And I've just had a couple of people who have specific reasons why it's best to come into the office, and we wear masks because that seems like the safe thing to do. But therapy with masks on is also bizarre. So, you know, it doesn't seem like, except with the people in our households, that we're able to connect at the level that we're used to, that we took for granted before, really.
I'd just like to add that a pastoral visit with masks on is very bizarre as well.
Yeah.
Lynn, did I interrupt you just then? Who did I interrupt? Nobody? Okay, raise your hand, please, if you've got a question. Anybody? Who's next? Okay, that's Joe Friedman.
Yes, I agree, Nisha. That was very well presented. It's very helpful. Thank you so much for doing this for us. I'm interested in the fear and anxiety kind of angle of this topic, because well, for example, my daughter and son-in-law, they lived in New York through the worst of everything, and so sometimes there's this huge fear, as she's a new mother, of, you know, what if I lose my husband? What if I lose my baby? What if when I go to have my baby, they won't let me hold it because I'm infected? And this can amount to, you know, panic. Is there any kind of tips or things that one can do to help keep that from spiraling out of, you know, just, well, yeah, that would be a thing to be concerned about, to I'm just wigging out here?
Yeah, and I think most wigging out some, and certainly those who are in the thick of it, you know, either geographically or for medical care or with, you know, different reasons. So back to the kind of model of the brain, I would say that in some ways it seems like we're stuck in anxious thoughts then, right? Like, oh my gosh, what if blah, blah, blah. And that is kind of coming from our cortical place, but really it's coming because that brain is so activated and just sure that we're in trouble and going danger, danger, danger. And I think, you know, there are red lights. I imagine at this point, red lights in my brain when I have those kinds of signals, like, so I think what, you know, the best we can do is try to approach that from the different levels. So you're doing all those things I said about like trying to increase safety cues, you know, like in their home, for instance, in New York, I would make things just as, you know, cozy and familiar and safe feeling as possible. And when you're not in a total state, it's good to challenge some of those thoughts. So sometimes there are odds that can reassure us. Again, in a pandemic, that is less true. There's actually this kid's book that's called When Bad Things Happen or something. And it's really made for, you know, when your kid freaks out because they heard about the tsunami on the other side of the world. And it sort of talks about, you know, like the marbles in the jar. And if you only have one dark marble and you've got all these light marbles, you know, then like all the white marbles mean that's not going to happen to you. But the dark marble, yes, you got to kind of live with the jar. And I think I don't use that with kids right now because it feels like everything is too close, right? Like there's looks like a lot of dark marbles from here. It's a little overwhelming. But I also think that brains in our attempt to keep us safe and adapt sometimes do jump to the, okay, it's this close now, so it's me, which is not obviously the guaranteed end. And then, you know, some of the what ifs, we are just having to make choices to not engage with them any more than we have to. They're there. Sometimes people find it helpful to have kind of a container strategy. So if you actually visualize, where would you like to put the scary thoughts that pop up in your brain? And some people want to, make a treasure chest at the bottom of the ocean, and some people want a big concrete container with a big lid, and some people want locks or bungee, people come up with all sorts of things. And it can sound kind of silly, but just like having that visual for like, that's where I keep that stuff. And when it pops up in my brain, that's where I'm going to. And for some people, it's just enough to put it away there. For other people, they need to bring it out and talk to somebody about it. And that's, I use that sometimes, or sometimes people might, bring it out kind of in a time when you're feeling calm to sort of sort through all the what ifs. Because sometimes people do need to make plans for, what if.
Yes, I have a niece in Houston who's got some severe health issues, and she's terrified of this approaching hurricane because she's physically unable to flee, and immune compromised on top of it, and so on. And so it feels like escapist or unrealistic to say, well, you just have to close your eyes. And because it's very real threat, so it is a very dangerous situation, and so it's hard to know how to give help that doesn't sound like just close your eyes and pretend that everything will be okay. And because even if God is good, which this is a Christian person, God is good, but He lets bad things happen to people. And my daughter tells me that, yeah, but Dad, no, God doesn't owe me anything. And I taught her too well, but I don't,
Yeah. So the one thing though is that none of us are really equipped to deal with that stuff 24/7, and certainly people in major trauma situations end up, in the middle of a hurricane or whatever. You have to focus on it completely. But these days, where we're worried about what might happen, it's good to have kind of a place to put it at times, and then a time to bring it out. And one thing you can offer people like that is like, I want you to be able to put it away, but if you need somebody to talk it through with, I'm available for that. I mean, that's one thing you could be for if they're needing it.
Thank you.
So Anisha, would it be fair to say, you can say no, Gina, that's not true, to say that if we offer ourselves, we can be some version of that container? You can always call me and talk to me.
Yes.
Is that a fair idea? Okay.
Yes.
Just, let me.
And that's, some therapists use that language. Like my consultant will say to me, "I am holding this for you."
Okay. Very good. Okay. In Kyle, we said, "I can be your huckleberry," but so we would say it. All right. Others. So I'm actually more interested in your questions than mine. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Let's call on you and discuss your issue. If not, I have 2 or 3 things, but to keep us rolling. Anybody? Okay, I see Marisa and then Cindy. So we'll do Marisa first and then Cindy.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question, maybe it's an observation, but so you're right about Zoom being a way to connect with people, especially when things were more concerning, I guess, when we just didn't know what was going on with the virus and how safe it was to go out. But as time went on, I found it more draining to be on Zoom, and I found it's like an illusion of connection sometimes. I don't know if that makes sense, but not really connecting. So sometimes I would feel more down after, like, say, or a small group would have a meeting. And it was hard because sometimes you couldn't hear people well. You didn't have as much, I think you touched on this, as much eye contact and feedback, especially when you can't hear somebody. So that's hard. And so then I don't know if you want to address why that seems more difficult sometimes.
Yeah, I just think that we're not really wired for this. We're wired to be in close proximity, and that's why we have all those great neurons that do that connection thing. And so we aren't, we're not doing. You're right. We're doing the one-off version, not the real thing. And that everything you just said is stuff I was hearing from therapists early in the pandemic too, because people are exhausted and it's harder to connect. And so
it's a little bit easier one-on-one, but when it's a group and your goal is like you were used to meeting in person with that group, and then you're not, you're on a screen. So that was harder, but kind of an addendum to that is that I noticed when we started, I guess it was the end of May, middle of May, we would meet with people, maybe a couple people and stuff outside that it doesn't affect Bob so much. I don't think any of this affects him like it does me, but I would feel healthier. And then when things seem safer, it's like, we'll meet outside. And it was, easier. The weather was nice and stuff, but I'm surrounded by a few people who normally have a lot of faith, or not fearful people, that have expressed a lot of fear and even anger and even judgment, like, those stupid people that aren't wearing masks, or, I can't believe those people went and saw a group or whatever. And it's just like, okay, well, I'm not sure that's very helpful. So I noticed their anxiety level and people around me, and I'm just not always sure how to respond to that. I don't know if you have any pointers for that. I mean, I want to be helpful, but I'm kind of in between. I feel like we need to be careful, but I also feel like, I hate to see people lose their businesses and be unemployed. I feel like a lot of times I'm navigating this kind of fine line.
And yeah, and I do think that's added another element to it, because we're used to our health decisions pretty much just impacting us. I mean, do I smoke? Do I drink? What do I eat? Do I exercise? And this is very different for us in America to have our health decisions basically affect everybody else. And I've seen that produce significant tension in families, and then also, in groups or beyond that. And they're polarized, big groups, obviously, that are in different places with that. So, I think it's important for us all to recognize that these are really hard decisions to make. I mean, it really is a bind, like I talked to my mom this morning. She's an extrovert who's almost 80. She is pretty much in a hard way mentally from having been totally isolated for these months, and yet terrified of going out. And it's kind of legit, right? I mean, if they get sick, their odds of it being serious are pretty good. So I think just recognizing that we've all had to make hard decisions, and trying to have empathy for the other person's hard decision. So like, if you have somebody who's anxious and all freaked out, I think that reflecting of where they're at is probably the best way to go. Just like, wow, it sounds like it's really scary for you, that you're making all these choices, and even that other people are making other choices. And yeah, it's really, can be overwhelming.
Okay. And I also want to add that this is very helpful, Nisha, and you did a great job. I really appreciate all the information. It was very clear and gave me a lot to think about. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So before we go to Cindy, Marisa, I want to make a point that I think most of us would understand that things impact you differently than they impact Bob. Just want to say, don't love you guys. I know you love you well. We get that. It's all right.
Yeah, he's pretty even keel and like whatever.
Yeah.
Our stuff's at the surface, so it's just down there, but it's still there.
I think it's true. I think it's true in a lot of us that are couples, because we are embracing it in different ways, and it's better to lean on each other than to push back against each other. Just want to say that. Okay.
Well, we also are spending a lot more time together, so there are challenges in that.
Indeed.
I love him.
Indeed. Okay, Cindy Bybee.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can.
Okay, good. Well, I was interested about what you said about people living in proximity, their brains syncing or affecting one another, because I've had a couple of major depressive episodes, and I've been in treatment for depression, for almost 30 years. So I have that going, and other family members. First of all, glory to God for medication.
Amen.
It is wonderful. So glad. But I have, in my family, other people who also struggle. So I'm thinking, what's the best way that I, in my household, can help, all of us to be, to lift each other up as best we can.
Yeah. And I think it can be really tricky when you've got multiple people. When Joe and I were preparing to get married, one thing the pastor said to us is, it's okay if one of you has a hard time, and it's okay if the other one has a hard time, but if you have a hard time at the same time, right, it's going to be difficult. And so if you have different family members, who struggle with depression, and then we add on all these external factors that are impacting, and I think it is really challenging. Probably important to have some outside sources of support so that you're not all kind of like in a, your brains are going to wire together some, but like you need some outside influences, especially if you've got more than one person struggling at a time. And that, part of my frustration these days has been that when I suggest resources to people, the options are different than they are in regular times, just in terms of who you connect with and whether you can go, be part of a group somewhere and whatever. But there are ways to do it. And, I think obviously professional help is great and community is great. Well, yes, medication is great. I also put in the list of resources, just meetups, which is, not treatment at all, but are some groups in town that are trying to meet virtually. And of course, we have the Hope community to draw from. Trying to get some outside input would be important. And all the things, I said about caring for each other are good in terms of, you probably know each other well enough to have some idea of what another person needs or responds well to. But that does change over time. And certainly in the pandemic, it's sometimes been different for people, even who had a history of, coping with some of these things. And so checking in about what they need, how can you be helpful, is an important piece. And then just, trying to find those little moments of joy and playfulness together. Because I think each household and can engage in that in person, they're very valuable. And that's not to say like, oh, we're happy now and everything's fine. But even when, unless you're at the most severe depression, even when you're feeling depressed, you can sometimes get that little bit of connection or kind of a little bit of shared smile. And, I think to our brains, those are really important moments.
Right. Thank you for that, Nisha. Okay, raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, I saw, I'm gonna go to Whitney and then back to Bob. Bob, you raised your hand, right? Okay, so Whitney and then Bob.
So as a educator, I'm trained to kind of look for certain signs in a classroom. And so I can do that pretty well in a classroom. Are there anything in your experience in these last 5 months that I should like really hone in on? Because it's going to be a lot different on the Zoom.
Oh, so you're talking about just doing a Zoom call, not a classroom, right?
I know. So when you're in person, you can feel things and you can sense things like Nisha's been talking about, and you get trained to see certain things. But now everybody is a head and a shoulder, and you can hide your arms and hands real simply. So I'm just wondering if in your experience, Nisha, you've found like some triggers that you were like, uh-oh, this person really, like in a session or something, since you've been doing them online-ish.
Yeah. And remind me what age group you work with, Whitney? Are you teens or younger?
I'm 11, 12, 13, 14.
Yeah, middle school. Okay. Yeah. So I'm picturing, kids in my head.
Yeah. They go in and out all the time.
Yeah.
You know what
you have less to go on for sure. I have seen, so you have to do a lot with facial expression because that's all you're going to see, right? And especially because you're not going to have them able to just talk in the same way that I get to. You're not going to have as much verbalization from them. I've certainly seen some kids move to that sort of flat affect. And I know it's also going to be hard if you don't know them already, because there are kids that sort of present that way anyway. But it would at least lead me to ask some questions if you're just kind of never seeing emotional expression in them. And I have seen some kids who get isolated and are just kind of shutting down in that way. Some of them are not desperately distressed, but they're just kind of not engaged. So I don't know what it'll be like beginning school, whether they'll be able to be more engaged or not. Like I said, that at that age, depression often manifests with more irritability than sadness sometimes. And so you may get kind of cranky comments or, you know, the crack here and there. And again, you're gonna have to figure out how much is that just them airing some stuff, because things are hard for everybody. But if that's all you ever get, then I would, you know, at least want to check in. Yeah. So it's not a lot to go on. I bless you in your work. I think it's
Yeah.
a weird time.
Thank you very much. Okay, Bob Odell.
Nisha, because we're all part of the family of faith here, and we all believe that the Word of God is, you know, a wonderful treasure. What? I'm just thinking about the way you perceive the world. I was fascinated by your comment about, you know, reading novels, but to see character development and so forth. And so I'm just wondering, are there favorite verses or favorite passages? You mentioned the Psalms for laments, you know, but with you and your perspective on the world, do you have some favorite passages? Do you have favorite verses? Do you share verses with people? You could take that question in 10 different ways, pick one and go with it.
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm the best person to offer some of that. And, you know, it just depends on, I don't, you know, because I think I struggle with this stuff. And in the middle of the heaviness of all this, you know, I go back to some basics, you know, he will never leave you or forsake you, and he will wipe away every tear from your eyes. And, you know, some promises, but very much aware of, like what Joe said earlier, that God allows really awful things to happen. And we've got an example running right now, right? And so figuring out how to make sense of those realities is a pretty big struggle for me. And so I'm not great at coming up like, oh, these are comforting verses or whatever. Certainly support that for people that can, you know, can rest more in them. But I think it's, you know, maybe especially recently I have more struggled with those. And also, you know, I have secular practice. And so I do have some people that I know came to me because they know that I'm a believer, but most of the people I see are not believers. And so I'm always, you know, trying to also navigate their worldviews, which are very.
Well, I just reflect back to you that you're quoting, I will wipe every tear from your eyes. I've never thought about that from the standpoint of psychology before. And I think that is a wonderful nugget for me to walk away with. Thank you.
Good. I do hang on to.
Okay. Again, please raise your hand so I can see you if you'd like to ask a question. I am more interested in your questions than mine. Is that Mandy Reinecker I see over there? It is. Okay, good. All right. So while everybody's thinking of their questions, Nisha, I want to go back to when you were talking about grief and loss, which was pretty early in your talk. And I didn't hear you, and then you gave the name to what you were talking about, which was ambiguous loss. And the fact that in this pandemic, it just stretches on and on and on, and there's no real end in sight. We're given hope in the news media for better testing and perhaps vaccines and all that kind of stuff. But there's really no, and so we are really hanging and waiting in this kind of interminable period. There's a promise of maybe some ending of this, a way out there, like it's, you know, like Payday Sunday. So you called this ambiguous loss and the feeling of that. What are because this is something I've spoken to actually in several sermons. I bring it up because I feel it, and I know people around me feel it a lot. And you know, I have had various scriptural responses. But in terms of what you see as a psychologist, is this similar to the loss of a loved one? And if so, how? And then how is it different? And are there ways of coping that are different from? Because you said there's no certain ending, no rituals to help, and that kind of got my attention. So, is there something you think we could invent? Maybe, you know, the unending ritual or something. I don't know. I'm just sort of teasing you. But what is the difference between ambiguous loss and just a grief and loss in a person that's concrete and can we deal with this?
Yeah, so in some sense, loss is loss. There's something that you had once that you don't have anymore, and you feel the lack of it. And so, and there, there are ways where I think it's similar, but I do think, there's an awfulness, obviously, to the certainty of like the loss of loved one through death. It's like that part's done. I mean, we know not forever, but done for this time, this earth. So that I don't at all want to play that down. But I think that because it's so awful as a culture, all cultures really have certain ways to deal with that, right? Like we have, you need to plan the funeral, and you need to pick the music, and you need to decide what the burial circumstances are, and you need to have the funeral and have everybody gather around you. And these days, have people greet you on Facebook with how, their condolences, and people bring you food, and and then hopefully people that, are close enough or care about you kind of check in with you over a period of months after that with like, how are you doing? I know that or even the anniversary of the date, oh yeah, your mom died last, September, right? So like, how are you doing with that? So we have ways that we form to help people through those things. And I just think there's not, ambiguous loss it's not my term. I can't remember that somebody's written a book about it, and it's about, various kinds of loss where there's not that, like where it's often more quiet and less public, which would be true for most of the losses. I mean, certainly people who have had a loved one in the hospital have died from COVID, I hope are sharing that and saying it. But for a lot of people, they've lost their job, or they've lost part of their income, or they lost their hope for what was going to happen within the next 2 years, or they lost, or like my daughter who lost the wedding that she really had planned and wanted, or the graduation ceremony, or the prom. So all of those are these losses that are smaller, but ongoing. And so they tend to kind of layer up, right, over time. And we don't know when they end. Some of them are ongoing losses, like, income, whatever is hit, and we don't know when it'll ever come back or if it'll come back. And even the stuff that's temporary, other things kind of keep coming on top of it. So the ongoing nature, I think, is hard. And there's no gathering of people around you about that generally. I hope some people have folks that are checking on them because they know they lost their job, or they own a small business or whatever, but it's not the same. We don't have, people are not bringing them food. People are not focused on their particular process. And so I do think that is hard. And I think it leaves people out of touch with their own loss in a way that's not always helpful. I mean, it kind of sounds nice not to be in touch with your loss, but in reality, it kind of affects you without you necessarily choosing to, without you seeing it or processing it or kind of moving through it. It can make you stuck.
Okay.
So it's interesting that you bring up the ritual thing. I mean, I have tried to use some tools that I've learned, like in therapy, with people to help them see and process this stuff. So one thing I've used is a web of loss. So like we draw, circles or ovals on a page, and there's big ones like, my school shut down or whatever. And there's small ones like, I can't see my this particular friend, or I can't play this sport or whatever. Or maybe my grandpa is sick, or, like have all those there. And then we connect them with lines. And one thing is just to help people understand that when that web gets hit, you feel kind of all of it, not just the one thing. Because sometimes,
yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Because sometimes people are confused, like, so I lost this game. Why am I so upset? Or this one event got canceled. It really wasn't that big a deal. What's wrong with me? That's what people think. But in fact, you have pulled on this entire web of other things that have been lost that just feels really, really big. So that doesn't make it go away, but I think it helps people sometimes
understand it. Yeah.
Understand their own reactions.
So I've run into a situation where people say, I feel bad and I don't know why. What you just said kind of helps me to understand the web of loss. I like that a lot. Thank you. That was very helpful. Good idea. Okay, I see Mandy has her hand up.
Hi, Mandy.
I'm so sorry I was late to your talk. I'm really sad that I had to
It's
feed everyone.
recorded. It's recorded. You can get it.
I know, but it's so fun to see it live. And so I'm sorry if my question, like you already spoke to it. But I was wondering if you could speak to like experience with PTSD and how that manifests. I mean, I feel like we have really almost cliche, like not cliche, but you know, an idea of, oh, in its most extreme form, this is what it looks like. But maybe if you could speak to smaller ways that it might creep into your everyday, just for me and my colleagues, especially, you know, it feels real, like that's a real thing that possibly we're beginning to encounter now that we're kind of getting to take a breath. So I would love to hear a mental health professional speak to that.
Yeah, sure. And you know, Mandy, I would be happy to talk about this another time if it's helpful to you beyond our time today. But so PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. It did come into being as a disorder like really after the Vietnam War and the 70s and beyond. And initially was a diagnosis that went with like veterans who've been in combat and had flashbacks and nightmares and all this stuff where their brain is putting them like they are in that traumatic situation again when they're not actually. And then it got extended because people noticed that you got a lot of the same response for people with severe abuse histories, like especially like, sexual trauma has a similar effect. And then slowly the field has sort of understood that trauma as a concept goes way beyond that, and that you can't even always guess how much impact a trauma is going to have it's not just an outside measure of like, was that a big deal? Was that unusual? Because for some people, some things will end up having more of a trauma effect than they would for somebody else, or than maybe an event that other people might consider a bigger deal would have for them. It's like, it's not that clear cut. So there's, a lot of information just starting to be gathered about people in the medical field through COVID. And yes, PTSD is a real thing. And there are people who are trying to be available and address that more directly. So a few things that might be helpful to know. I mean, one is that we do process trauma differently if we process it with somebody else versus processing it alone. So holding it all on your own makes your odds of having PTSD symptoms higher. Having somebody that you feel like you're sharing it with, not necessarily that they're beside you during the trauma, but just that they're able to, reflect your emotions, help you process, be in it with you, be like, your supporter. That's really important. And so it's worth seeking during instead of waiting to see whether you have symptoms later, to get that. And sometimes, it can be a prevention as well, but certainly good to use even if you eventually have some problems. What else? So we talk some about how the brain works, and you do get these trauma responses when you are seriously in danger, which it feels like you're in danger, certainly in your field, and it's real. But there's also just kind of the psychological danger of being overwhelmed with other people suffering and all the demands. That's really tough. And so our brains, when we feel very threatened, or we're in situations that are really hard, our process of encoding memory is different. And so it becomes where, or it's kind of, I think of it like a little pod in your brain, which is not, this isn't exactly the biology of it, but it's kind of memory processing theory. So it's like that event or that ongoing event becomes like this part in your brain that is sort of encapsulated. It's kind of, it's one of the ways our brains are trying to protect us and keep us functioning and adapting to situations. But in order to do that, it becomes kind of hardened, is the way I think of it. And then that will affect all the ways you interpret other events in your life, and not necessarily be integrated in with the rest of it. It's kind of like your brain sort of sets it to the side, and then it impacts things, but it doesn't change. So like, for instance, you know, God willing, when this pandemic ends and some of this goes away, or when the veterans were no longer in combat, you know, it's like you think, okay, well now all of those safety experiences will come in and that'll break that apart and it won't be like that anymore. But because we needed it to survive really hard situations, our brains will hang on to those memories as like these separate things, and they just color other stuff and they don't change themselves really. So the problem is seen as partly a lack of integration. So just there are some ways, there's some treatments that are helpful with that, but I think it's also good to know that processing what happened in those hard moments with a supportive person is one way that you can have that not form into like that hard pod kind of, so that it's like you're kind of intentionally integrating it in with other experiences and having support for it, so that your brain doesn't need to protect itself by putting that in a separate, eventually harmful, often place. So that's a little out there in terms of what we were covering, but yeah, is the real risks, Mandy, and I'm happy to help direct you to resources or talk about it more.
Well,
How helpful is it if mostly your husband is that supportive person?
Well, pros and cons.
He's like, oh,
Talked about a while ago with Cindy, where like you can have it all in house and it can start to feel pretty, you know, it's awesome because available and caring and all that stuff, but also probably important to have some other input just for everyone's long-term health.
we're happy for you to do that, but I would encourage you to talk to Nisha offline some other time as well. I mean, I'm not saying shut down the conversation, but we're going to run out of time here in a minute. So Nisha, I wanted to back you up as you were talking to Andy. I thought, man, if you could go in a little bit more depth. You said get somebody to help you process the trauma. My assumption is you mean talk about it, but my guess is you don't mean just to have a happy old conversation. Tell me what you mean by process with somebody, if you can.
That's because there's like, I have certain thoughts about how you do that in a therapy session, which is a little different than kind of what you find in life. So
think of you, I'll do it this way. Think of Mandy talking to a fellow nurse who's experienced some of the same trauma as she's experienced. How does Mandy help her friend process?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing is that to integrate that memory in with everything else, you have to actually kind of light up that network of memory, and it has to be more than just cognitive. So like telling somebody, you know, oh, I had this really hard day, so-and-so got really sick, and, you know, kind of recounting the facts alone doesn't go as far. So as hard as it is, and this is why you have to have, you know, somebody that you really trust, you have to kind of get in touch with that emotion, and they have to be in a place where they can kind of hold that. So that would be the other thing, is that, you know, I don't want to recommend this and have then people go off and like seek it in places that it's not, because then you can actually feel worse afterwards. So you need to make sure that somebody's got capacity to help with it, or like, you know, or to offer it. You got to be sure you're in a place to offer it, which I think for medical providers these days, like they may not be the best people. I mean, they're going to understand where you're coming from, but they're, like we talked about earlier, with everybody affected so much, they're just so affected themselves. So I think finding people who are not in the thick of it as much, who have kind of emotional capacity to deal with that, and then to intentionally share not just some of the events, but your emotions around it, how it made you feel about yourself. I mean, you know, there's a lot of, I'm imagining, helplessness. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, kind of the thoughts that we have about ourselves in a situation are some of the most powerful. And so at least being able to, you know, say, not only this happened, but I was so sad, and I felt like I, you know, was just helpless to do anything in that. And so, you know, being able to share those things and having somebody else be a safe container for that is important. So it's just like, it's not, like you said, a happy conversation or just kind of the chat. And people can do that about the worst things, right? People can just say it exactly, but it doesn't have the same brain effect.
Okay. Okay. So I assume, Whitney, you want to ask a question, right? So I'm going to disallow it unless it's a 30-second answer. Is it a simple question?
Maybe.
Okay. So here's the deal. We got 4 minutes, and I still have something else Nisha needs to do for us.
I thought you said our questions were more important than yours.
It's what I want. I don't have another question. It's something I want Nisha to do. But go ahead.
So in 30 seconds, Nisha, can a clinically depressed person have high emotional intelligence? Or so social emotional intelligence is all about, I don't have to explain that, right?
Right. No, I got you. So the thing is that social emotional intelligence tends to be a stable state, or like ability, trait, depends on how you see it. Whereas depression tends to come in episodes. And so you could certainly have a what you said,
Yeah.
and have them be depressed. I mean, it's not like those things don't fit together. If they're depressed enough, then their ability to take in what's going on with somebody else and respond in a way that seems socially, whatever, helpful, appropriate, is going to diminish while feeling that depressed. But certainly I think I kind of see a lot of people that would be considered highly sensitive people and that are great at those things, but there's some risk with that temperament for having some of these mood disorders.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are you okay, Whitney? You satisfied with that? You can make an appointment, and I think she only charged you $150 an hour. Hey, Nisha, what I'd like for you to do as we close out is I would like for you to go to the chat and just kind of walk us through the resources that you put in the chat, okay?
Okay.
Everybody go, just turn on the chat and you'll see what Nisha is saying.
Okay, so the first one is NAMI, which is, it's just a resource page that they have, but NAMI is kind of like they do have some support groups that are online and that are not treatment, but would be a place to talk with other people who are feeling down through this. And then they have a list of other resources. So that's the first one. The second one is Psychology Today that I mentioned earlier, where if you're looking for a therapist or a psychiatrist or provider, to consider medication, you can check things in there and it'll screen it for you and give people who might be available. One thing to remember right now is that because almost everybody is teletherapies, they don't actually have to be in Austin. Likewise, they need to be in Texas, but especially like if you're wanting, a Christian therapist that takes insurance, that's really hard to find, but you have the whole state to look in. So, you might want to search for that if you're open to doing teletherapy. And then there's my email, which you're welcome to use to ask me follow-up questions, or if certainly you need help finding a provider, I'm happy to do that. And there are ways that I can ask Unlike Professional List who has openings and sometimes make it more efficient. Meetup I mentioned because they have different groups with different interests, and I think they're still having some outdoor events, but also some of those groups are meeting virtually. And if you're feeling like you need more contact than your Hope Small Group or other things you have available to you, it is a way that you can at least make contact with people. And then I have 2 Christian counseling centers down there, the Center for Relational Care and the Timothy Center. I realize both of those are North Austin, and I'm just more versed in North Austin resources. So I'm sure there's something similar down south. But those are both places where everyone there is works from a Christian perspective. The Center for Relational Care, especially, I feel like their confidence level is very high. It's where I go for my own care. The Timothy Center, though they take no insurance, the Timothy Center does take insurance, and a dad and son, 2 Christian psychologists, opened that just a couple years ago, and they're doing great work in meeting needs of people that otherwise I think were not getting what they needed. So those are some places to consider if you think you need some extra support.
Thank you, Nisha. You hit it on the nose. This 8 o'clock. We're going to call it quits for the night. But everybody, would you just say thank you to Nisha? Nisha was beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nisha. Really,
You're welcome.
That was great.
I'm happy to merge my worlds now and then.
It was fantastic. I wish I had previewed something like this earlier, because I would have split this into 2 talks. our 2 sessions, one dealing with anxiety and depression and another one on post-traumatic stress. But maybe we can come back and, yeah, because we ended up talking about that a lot. So we can think about coming back again later. But anyway, Nisha, that was a beautiful evening. Thank you very, very
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, everybody,
So welcome.
we're going to say goodbye. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.